In the mid-19th century, the world was understood to be a finished product. Every living thing, from the smallest insect to the blue whale, was believed to have been placed on Earth in its final form. This was the undisputed baseline for both science and faith. Nature was perfect, static, and unchanging. By the 1850s, Charles Darwin had retreated to Down House, a quiet estate in the English countryside. He lived as a semi-invalid, plagued by chronic nausea and heart palpitations that kept him far from the scientific circles of London. He was a man protecting a conviction he was too frightened to share. The source of that anxiety sat in his study, a private leather diary he called Notebook B. On one page, Darwin had written two words that contradicted the entire Victorian world: "I think." Below those words, he drew a jagged, branching diagram, a tree of life. It suggested that species were not fixed at all, but were instead changing, splitting off from a common trunk into the diverse forms of the modern world. Admitting this realization was a professional and social death sentence. To claim that species changed meant the Genesis story of creation was not a literal account of history. Darwin knew that once the wall between species fell, the traditional hierarchy of the world would fall with it. He wrote to a friend that finally revealing his theory felt like confessing a murder. This perspective took decades to build. It began in his 20s, aboard the HMS Beagle. Darwin spent years as a profoundly seasick amateur naturalist, but the moment he stepped onto the shores of South America, his focus shifted to the physical evidence beneath his feet. While exploring the cliffs of Punta Alta in Argentina, Darwin used a pickaxe to extract the massive, fossilized remains of elephant-sized ground sloths and armored armadillo-like creatures that had long been extinct. He noticed a pattern he called the law of succession. He looked at the giant, extinct sloth in the ground, and then at the small tree sloths in the jungle nearby. He wondered why a creator would wipe out giant animals only to replace them with miniature versions of the exact same creatures in the exact same location. In Chile, he experienced a massive earthquake that leveled cities. Afterward, he walked the shore and saw that the tremor had physically pushed the coastline several feet out of the water, leaving rotting mussels stranded on rocks that were previously submerged. Darwin realized he was seeing the Earth change in real time. If the planet itself was shaped by slow, gradual forces over millions of years, it stood to reason that the animals living on that planet were forced to adapt and change right along with it. This theory solidified in the Galapagos Islands, a harsh, volcanic landscape home to creatures found nowhere else on Earth, including giant tortoises that had lived there for centuries. The local vice-governor told Darwin he could identify which island a tortoise came from just by looking at the shape of its shell. Darwin realized that the birds and reptiles on these isolated islands had physically drifted away from their mainland ancestors to suit their specific environments. Back in London, Darwin read an essay by an economist named Thomas Malthus, who argued that human populations grow much faster than the food supply, making death and competition inevitable. Because resources are limited, most offspring die before they can breed. This creates a war for survival, where the environment selects the few individuals born with a slight advantageous trait, like a better beak for cracking seeds. He called this process natural selection. By the late 1830s, Darwin had the answer, yet he locked his notebooks away. He spent the next 20 years obsessively studying barnacles and earthworms, stalling to build a mountain of evidence that might protect him from the coming backlash. That paralysis ended in 1858 when a letter arrived from Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace was a collector working in the Malay archipelago, and while shivering with a malarial fever, he had independently arrived at the exact same conclusion Darwin had been hiding for 2 decades. Wallace's letter contained a perfect summary of Darwin's secret. If Darwin didn't publish immediately, he would lose credit for 20 years of work. This letter was the final pressure that forced him to finally show his theory to the world. Darwin spent 13 months in a frantic sprint to condense his evidence into a single volume. On the Origin of Species was published in 1859, and the first printing sold out instantly. The response was as volatile as Darwin had predicted. The press published vicious caricatures, and the religious establishment attacked the book as a threat to the moral order of society. Darwin avoided the conflict, but his friend Thomas Huxley stepped into the public eye to defend the theory. In 1860, Huxley faced off against Bishop Samuel Wilberforce at Oxford in a debate that drew hundreds of spectators and turned the theory into a national obsession. The Oxford debate signaled a shift in how science was conducted. By using physical evidence to answer the bishop's mockery, Huxley demonstrated that the question of life's origins was moving from the realm of theology into the realm of public, evidence-based scrutiny. In 1871, Darwin finally published The Descent of Man, explicitly applying his theory to human beings. He argued that our bodies and our intelligence were not special creations, but the products of the same evolutionary forces that shaped every other animal. By the end of Darwin's life, the evidence from new fossil discoveries and biological studies had become so overwhelming that the scientific community largely accepted his conclusions. Charles Darwin died in 1882. The man who had spent his life terrified of being an outcast was given a state funeral and buried in Westminster Abbey, just a few feet away from the grave of Isaac Newton. In the centuries since, the discovery of DNA and the mapping of the human genome have not replaced Darwin's theory. Instead, they have confirmed his observations down to the molecular level, showing that all life is indeed connected by a single shared history. Darwin's legacy is the realization that the chaotic struggle for survival is the engine of creation. He saw grandeur in the fact that from a simple beginning, nature has produced the endless, beautiful diversity of the world we see today.